Good afternoon, Terry Presta with Liberty PAC. Do you know what inflation is? Inflation is nothing more than an expansion of the money supply, the amount of money in circulation. So it's with great amazement that I watched Jerome Powell. I don't know how he does it with a straight face. And some of the other Fed governors come on and say, we don't see much inflation. Well, 40% of the world's money, dollars, ever printed, were printed last year in the USA. And I know they blamed it on COVID, and COVID shutting down had something to do with it, yes. But the repo market in September of 18 between the banks also had a lot to do with it. So our Fed is now printing $120 billion a month to deal with the repo market, which obviously over $1 trillion a year. And then they are also printing money for all these programs like they're going out of style. Last year, we had basically about a $3.1 trillion deficit that was basically funded more by printing than it was by taxes. More than half of the money printed or spent was printed, which is absolutely an inflationary problem, and it's one of the precursors that you have to go through if you're going to hyperinflate, debase your currency and have hyperinflation. Now we all understand hyperinflation when we see it. We see the prices changing rapidly, but that's not really the inflation. The inflation is actually the growth of the money supply. It's some people think this is nuanced, but it's very important to understand that when they're funding operations as they are now massively by printing money, that's inflation. And when it gets away from them, it's hyperinflation. And I want to show you something right now on a little book I read a long time ago. Here we go. Okay, and here you see the book. It's by Andrew Dickinson White. He is actually the gentleman that founded Cornell University up in New York. Very smart guy. And he studied the breakdown of the currency and the resulting hyperinflation in France back during the French Revolution, which led to the dissolution of the state. Les Mis is the play that you see about that, and of course the breakdown with Robespierre and guillotine people and Marie Antoinette. All that was done because they debased the currency in France. And this goes exactly through what they did and how they did it and what it caused. And it was the politicians that led the charge, and there was a lot of, and it had happened, actually it had happened 70, 80 years in advance of this the first time. And so there were a lot of people that still remembered that tried to stop the government for doing it. But what happens is they get into a trap that they can't get out of. And we see that happening right now in the USA. And as they say, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And I'm going to go down here a little bit and show you how this starts, the very first paragraph of the book. And this is available online. You don't even have to pay for it. And the foreword by John McKay. And here's how it starts. Early in the year 1789, the French nation found itself in deep financial embarrassment. There was a heavy debt and a serious deficit. Statesmanlike measures, careful watching, and wise management would, doubtless, have ere long led to a return of confidence, a reappearance of money, and a resumption of business. But these involved patience and self-denial, and thus far in human history, these are the rarest products of political wisdom. Few nations have ever been able to exercise these virtues, and France was not one of them. And I would say America, under its current system, is not one of them. And it is eerily similar what they went through that absolutely ruined their country and led to a military dictatorship under Napoleon. And then, of course, Napoleon declared himself emperor, because when you break down the whole society and people can't eat, They don't just sit at home and starve. They come out, and there are riots and food riots and all sorts of things. And of course, in this book, which is the same thing that'll happen here, it'll be broken down by non-market forces, and yet what will happen? They will blame capitalism. They'll say the greedy capitalists caused this, when it's exactly the opposite of that. So as we go through this, what happened? Well, it really is a robbing of people of their property. What happens is the people that see this coming, which are all of those, me including all those watching this, and a lot of other people, I'm not saying we're the only ones that see this, they go out and buy assets. They buy assets before anybody knows what's going on. In this book, there were people that had had a farm for hundreds of years, and they sold the farm for over 5 times what they thought it was worth just a year earlier. And they kept the money in cash, and of course, within a year, they couldn't even buy a small house, what they'd got for their whole farm. And so what happens is the people who see this coming, and in our case in America, some of the people causing it are out buying assets. I have people calling me. We have a condo down on the plaza. I have people calling me, hey, will you sell your condo? Will you sell your condo? I have a friend that has a friend in from the East Coast trying to buy 1,000 acres of land. Why is he trying to do that? He's trying to convert his cash into hard assets. Who else is doing that? It just came out that Bill Gates is now the biggest landowner in America. Why would he do that? He sees the hyperinflation coming. He knows that his money, or cash, was going to go to nothing, but he knows that land will still be very valuable. So here's the guy who acts like he's in the dust settles. The people in the know will have all of the assets, and very few, everybody else will be like serfs. They won't own anything, even the ones in the middle class that own stuff. And so it's a very, very destructive force that is headed our way. Here's a little reading from the first issuance of money. The first result of the issue was apparently all that the most sanguine could desire. The Treasury was at once greatly relieved. A portion of the public debt was paid. Creditors were encouraged. Credit revived. Ordinary expenses were met. And a considerable part of this paper money, having thus been passed from the government into the hands of the people, trade increased, and all the difficult seems to vanish. Anxieties of Necker, the prophecies of Maury and Canals seem proven utterly futile. And indeed, it is quite possible that if the national authorities had stopped with this issue, few of the financial evils which afterward arose would have been severely felt. And so that's what happens. You know, that's where we're at now. We've issued a couple of these stimulus plans, and everybody is relieved. Everybody is happy. Kristen and I went to a restaurant last week as the checks were coming out, and it was packed. And it was good for everybody, right? The people are having a good time. The restaurants are full. You can't hardly buy things. But inflation, as I mentioned, is just the amount of money in circulation, usually over chasing the same basket of goods. What we have now is we have more money coming in, and we have the basket of goods going down. When you shut down businesses and tell people to stay home, and they're not producing anything, the amount of stuff in the market goes down. And we've all seen that. And so more money chasing fewer is even more inflationary. And that's exactly what happened in France. We're on the sugar high now, and it's right now, and it's fun. And it's great because people did need that money, and when they got it, there is a sigh of relief. I can pay my bills, I can go do some stuff, and it generally inflates the business community at first. And so this next pages debate the second issuance, and there was great debate about whether it should happen or not. And of course they declared the first one a great success because the people were having fun and business was flourishing. Again, they were on the sugar high, just what we see that we're in right now in the U.S. And there was a lot of people, the few people who said this was unwise because of the experience with John Law 75 years earlier, were just drowned out. We're totally drowned out because there was such a euphoria for all this newfound economic activity, which was based on money printed out of thin air that did not represent the labor of the workforce, but represented just Santa Claus. And so France was now fully committed to inflation, it says, and if there had been any question of this before, all doubts were removed by very significant, the exceeding difficulty of stopping a nation once in the full tide of a depreciating currency. And that's where we are right now. So as we see, as I go down, they issued a second issuance. And this was in 1790, so just a year later, or less than a year later, they issued the second one. I want to read this part. It says, the great majority of Frenchmen now became desperate optimists, declaring that inflation is prosperity. Throughout France, there came a temporary good feeling. The nation was becoming inebriated with paper money. That of drops of paper money came faster, the successive periods of good feelings grew shorter. So what happened on the second issuance? On the second issuance, the euphoria was much shorter lived, and the economic activity, of course, was much shorter and not as manifest as it was on the first time, which is just natural, because as more and more money floods in, it buys less and less goods. Here it says, soon manufacturing became more and more difficult, and thus came a collapse in manufacturing and commerce, just as it had previously done in France, just as it had came in all these other countries, and in all countries where men have tried to build up prosperity on irredeemable paper. So all the breakdown of manufactures and commerce, a nation made fearful inroads on the greater fortunes, but on the lesser, so that basically what they're saying, the rich people made greater fortunes because they had the capital and they saw what was going on. They bought up a lot of the land, like Bill Gates, and they bought up a lot of the stuff at the early stages before the inflation had hit. And a lot of the middle class and the other people lost everything. They sold it early, and when their money was inflated to zero, it basically was the greatest transfer of wealth that France had ever seen to that point. Okay, here comes an important point. Nor was there any compensating advantage to the mercantile, or the retailers. The merchant was forced to add to his ordinary profit a sum sufficient to cover probable or possible fluctuations in value. And while prices of products thus went higher, the wages of labor, owing to the number of workmen who were thrown out of unemployment, went lower. So it's the worst case scenario for the average individual. The prices go up rapidly and your labor just stays where it's at. This is the second phase after the sugar high wears off. Now we're on page 28, and we are basically in 1791, less than 2 years in, and this is an interesting piece. It says, at the great metropolitan centers grew a luxurious speculative stock gambling body, which like a malignant tumor absorbed into itself the strength of the nation and sent out its cancerous fibers to the remotest hamlets. At these city centers, abundant wealth seemed to be piled up. In the country at large, there grew a dislike of steady labor and contempt for moderate gains and simple living. So what are we seeing now with the Robin Hood thing and all that? We're seeing people they see this stock gambling, see the stock market as a casino. They can make huge amounts of money, and they say, why should I work? I don't want to work. I want to sit here on my computer, of course they didn't have those back then, and make all this money. I don't want to go work. They're talking about minimum wage. They're not even talking about that. I don't want to go back work for 80 or 100,000 a year when I can make that in a couple of months. Stock gambling in the casino, because everything is going up. Here's an interesting paragraph right here. Now began to be seen more plainly some of the many ways in which an inflation policy robs the working class. As these knots of plotting schemers at the city centers were becoming bloated with sudden wealth, the producing classes of the country, though having their possessions more and more currency, grew lean. In the schemes and the speculation put forth by the stock jobbers and stimulated by the printing of more currency, multitudes of small fortunes were absorbed and lost, while a few swollen fortunes were rapidly aggregated in the largest cities, aka Bill Gates. I wouldn't mind putting Warren Buffett in there, and all the hedge funds. That's what they're good at. They're good at getting out in front of the crowd, having access to the capital through their buddies at the Fed, and buying stuff in advance. Okay, so it talks about the politicians who started to get in on it, even the ones some of them that were thought to be very honest early on, or always had been. When they saw this rush of money being made everywhere, they started taking bribes, etc. And that caused a problem, of course. Even worse than this was the breaking down of the morals of the country at large, resulting from the large and sudden building up of ostentatious wealth in a few very large cities, and from the gambling, speculative spirit spreading from these to the small towns and rural districts. Do you see what's happening with Tesla, what's happening with Bitcoin, what's happening with GameStop? Yes, you see it. It's the exact same thing. From this was developed an even more disgraceful result, the decay of a true sense of national good faith. In other words, and by the superabundant currency, in other words, everybody lost sight of everything else. It was just a big free-for-all for more, and that's nature. Human nature is to maximize your situation. A lot of people preach altruism, but they always preach it for somebody else. For them, they're trying to maximize, and that's what was going on in France. Okay, here we are, and here's how we get into how people, they don't steal your property, but they appropriate your property by paying you with a depreciating currency, if you know what I mean. And here's what it says. This outgrowth was a vast debtor class in the nation, directly interested in the depreciation of the currency. So they wanted the currency to go to zero, in which way they would pay their debts. Only small payments down had been required, and the remainder was paid in deferred installments. So in other words, if you buy a farm for $1 million and finance it all and have a fixed rate interest rate, you absolutely get that farm over these 2 years basically free. You pay it back with very depreciated currency. So people get used to this, and as the effects wore off, they need more and more. By December 1791, a new issue was ordered. So they originally said it was just going to be the one, then they did the second, and now we're on the third. And then here on page 35, we see issue after issue followed at intervals of a few months until on December 14th, 1792, we have an official statement to the effect that 35 millions had been put forth. So they're just printing them as fast as they can. Okay, here's an interesting change that we've seen exactly today. It was demanded that a tax be laid, especially on the rich, to the amount of 400 million francs to buy bread. Now bread is getting so expensive that people can't afford it, and this is by February 1793, 4 years into this debacle. At 8 o'clock in the evening, a mob of men and women in disguise began plundering the stores and shops of Paris. First they demanded only bread. Soon they insisted on coffee, rice, sugar, and at last they seized everything that they could get their hands on. So what happened next? Well, with the rapid rise in foodstuffs and prices of labor not keeping up with it, they tried to fix the price, and of course that's a mistake, as Nixon found in the 70s. When you fix the price below what a merchant can deliver it for, the shelves become bare. We've just seen that recently in Venezuela. You fix the price at, say, $1, and it costs the merchant $2 to buy the product. He or she cannot provide the product. They can't sell it and lose $1, so it disappears and it becomes a great black market. Here we see what happened to some of the prices. Bushel of flour in 1790, 40 cents, 1795, $45. Oats, 18 cents to $10. Cartload of wood from $4 to $500, etc., etc. I don't need to go through all of that. But this is what happens when you start issuing a fiat currency to your heart's desire with nothing backing it, absolutely nothing other than the moronic ideas of Nancy Pelosi, AOC, Bernie Sanders, people like that. They think this is, they call it modern monetary theory now, but it's exactly what these morons did in France. Here's the prologue. I talk about all the printing. It brought, as we have seen, commerce and manufacturers, the mercantile interest and the agriculture interest to ruin. It brought on the same destruction which would come to a Hollander opening the dikes of the sea to irrigate his garden in a dry summer. It ended in the complete financial, moral, and political prostration or ruin of France, a prostration from which only a Napoleon could raise it. So there you go. That is the story of the French Revolution, and what caused it was the unlimited printing of a fiat currency. And right now, a similar thing happened in the Weimar Republic, which was Germany before World War II, that led to Hitler. Whenever the danger that we face is that Napoleon went out and started a world war, and the only way out of it was several million deaths of French men and soldiers. It was the only thing that kept them from starving. Hitler went out and started a world war, and 70 or 80 million people were killed. Whenever you debase your currency, you get the sugar high, you get the original relief from pressure, sugar high that we're seeing right now, but it leads to total destruction of the country. And the only people that come out better are the people that understand not to be in paper currency, because it's a fast depreciating asset, and they go out and buy assets. Maybe the ones that can lend or borrow, excuse me, which would be like our hedge funds and the people that have the ears of the big banks. They buy up all the assets, and everybody else is left in ruins. And capitalism is blamed, and it's not capitalism. It's the exact opposite of capitalism. All of this going on right now is the exact opposite of capitalism. The markets aren't free. The money in capitalism, money represents the frozen representation of your work. You go out and work, and then you get some money for it, and there's a correlation there. If we just print the money out of thin air and hand it out to everybody, and we take the production down, we are doing a double dirty deed that will increase the inflation. And I really believe the biggest question is this purposeful? In France, I don't believe it was purposeful. I think they got into it and they couldn't get out of it. People should be smarter today. And so you've got all these people that I talked about in another one is talking about the Great Reset. Maybe they see what's coming. Maybe they're hopeful for what's coming. I don't know why they would. It's going to be horrible, and it's going to be very bad for a lot of people. And a lot of people, again, as I said, it will be the greatest transfer of wealth from everybody to the few at the top, and it will cause a terrible amount of resentment, if not more. So I wanted to let people know what's coming. I've alluded to it before, but it's going to be bad.